Good evening. I'm Stuart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. And a couple of things coming up you should know about. One is there's a reception afterwards over at the Long Now Museum and Shop, half a block that way. The next speaker, Linad Zarius, is actually Daniel Suarez for dyslexics. He wrote a novel which you can get outside called Daemon, or Demon, being the computer technical term for a certain kind of quasi-AI bot. My wife is reading the book right now, and it's defeating sleep for her. It's an incredibly well-written book. And he's going to come and do something for the first time, which is talk about the ideas behind that book and the sequel, which is coming, called Freedom, TM, trademark. September 9th, Neal Stephenson's new book, Anathem, will be world launched from here with Long Now. And that's partly because he got the idea for the book from the clock at the Long Now. And there will be live music. It's a sort of a monastic order that goes with the 10,000 millennium clock. And they do a certain kind of singing, which is highly mathematical. And there's some singers who have developed that sort of music, and they're going to perform it live. Neal will read from the book, and Danny Hillis and Neal will talk about the book and everything else. That'll be September 9th. We're not sure where yet. We want to have it somewhere echoey so the music reverberates the way it should. September 9th is a Tuesday night. The clock, Danny Hillis's 10,000, Alexander Rose's 10,000-year clock is a work of art. It's a piece of land art in a way, a piece of conceptual art in a way, and a piece of engineering, more importantly. And art is about art. So the sign that you've got some art that's up to something is when it makes other artists do things they might not otherwise have done. So Neal Stephenson's book is one of those. And what we'll see tonight is another, the great photographer, Edward Burtynsky.
Thank you, Stuart. It's really exciting to be here in San Francisco again. I always enjoy coming to San Francisco. And I really thought about how I ended up doing this talk, and it came as a result of two dinners. One dinner with Danny Hillis about a year ago, and he was telling me more about the 10,000-year clock and the idea of it, the inception of it, what the intention of it is, and how it's supposed to function out there, which I was all ears. And out of that conversation, I said, this really reminds me of some other things that I've heard about, James Turrell's Rodin Crater, the lightning fields of Walter de Maria, other types of land art pieces out there that kind of encourage a pilgrimage to it for those who are really interested in the arts, or interested in conceptual ideas, or interested in land art, or interested in concepts, that this kind of place that has something very special going on, I think captures our imagination today when we're inundated with homogeneity and that everything is becoming more and more the same, the things we buy, the things we drive, the things we live in. So, and also how we think about things. Like this particular project captured my imagination because at first I thought, now, in the day and age where we're all talking about global warming and trying to figure out how to make it through the next 50, 100 years, it doesn't seem to be a little odd to be talking about a clock that can run by itself for 10,000 years. And I just thought, is this really where we should be paying attention right now when we've got a fire in the kitchen and we're trying to think about how to design our next living room out on the edge of our house. And I thought this is kind of an odd place to be right now, especially for thinkers like Danny and Alexander and the Long Now. And then I started to hear more about, well, why what is it that makes this a compelling idea for our time? And I think, again, it's what it is that the foundation has come to, is that we have, I was just reading the press release that Brian Eno had done when he talked about doing the chimes. By the way, the music you're hearing were the experimental chimes that would be part of the clock when you were coming in. But he was saying, we've come to a point, both our politicians, our corporate leaders, everybody is thinking in very short terms, the next quarter, the next election, the next, but it's not to any distant future. We're not thinking even 10, 20, 30 years out. We're just thinking just ahead of where we are right now, which is a kind of thinking that gets us into serious trouble, as we all, I think, can appreciate that there are definite issues with that kind of short-term thinking. And so when I was talking to Danny at this dinner, I said, well, I like the idea that you begin to start to shape the way you think, because everything then, all your materials, all the way you're thinking is about this future. It's not only very optimistic, it's also very creative in that, well, how do we begin to make something of enduring quality? And that making of something of enduring quality forces us out of short-term thinking. And it's as simple, really, as that. So when I heard this, I said, well, Danny, I think it would be really interesting if somebody's going to make a pilgrimage to see this clock in this mountain, in this chamber in this mountain. Wouldn't it be interesting to do something more, to give that person who made the pilgrimage a little bit more to digest when they get there? Why not do a gallery of images within the chamber of the clock? And he kind of turned to me and he said, of all the ideas, and I get lots of ideas of what to do along with the clock, I really like this idea. And I'm sorry Danny wanted to be here tonight, but he's extremely busy right now, and he's promised to look at the video, so I expect you to look at the video, so Danny. So anyways, so he really thought that this was a beautiful coming together of ideas, that he liked it, and he said, I'd like you to think more about that and find out more about that. So I started researching, and so that was the first dinner that got me to stand here tonight. The second one was with Stuart about 5 months ago or 6 months ago here in San Francisco, and it was after an exhibition of mine on quarries. We were having a dinner, and Stuart turned to me and we were talking about this, and he said, I think you should talk about this at one of our talks. And I went, gee, I never thought of doing a talk on it, but sure, I'll certainly try to put these thoughts together and present them to the audience here. So this is the first time I'm presenting this idea. It's been an interesting journey in that I didn't know where I was going to end up. I just started to pull away tug at ideas, and I'll talk about them as I go through it. But the Gallery of the 10,000-Year Clock, this is a quick little proposal that I put forward. This is a proposal to create a gallery of permanent images to be exhibited in the chamber of the 10,000-year clock. This clock will have the ambition and capacity to keep accurate time without human intervention for a period of 10,000 years. The clock would be installed in a chamber within a mountain and be powered by the cycles of day and night. The gallery will display 20-plus images curated by a variety of current thinkers and image specialists who will be asked to select a group of images that would reflect the impulse of the cave painters of Lascaux, that could loosely be defined by this quote from Wenzel van Huysen, who is an expert in the caves. The paintings are the oldest symbols of human imagination, and they certainly had some religious and mythological meaning. They tell us about who our direct ancestors were, what they thought, and what they could do. They tell us about imagination, about creativity, about consciousness, and about the Creator. The clock and the mountain that contains it will enter into the realm of destinations worthy of pilgrimage to witness and experience. Those who make that effort would be rewarded not only with the marvel of the clock, but also a contemporary update to the impulses of the cave painters of Lascaux, an exhibition of images that the curators believe represent the creative expressions, values, desires, and concerns of our current culture. The images that are selected will not necessarily be a complete compendium of our value system, thus reading like a time capsule for future generations. Rather, it will reflect contemporary manifestations of our individual and collective will. I can imagine exhibitions along the following lines: our built world, using nature, science and technology, objects of desire, notions of beauty, mobility, energy, freedom, and the middle class, conflict, Darwin versus God, pursuit of outer space and the cosmos, and so on. And unlike the painters of Lascaux, who were not painting for the enlightenment of future generations, but for the benefits and values, we today live with extended consciousness and cannot help but consider what might be interesting to leave behind as symbolic representation of who we are and what we aspire to. So that's kind of the working parameter of what I was beginning to think about in doing the clock. And so the clock itself, I don't know how many, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. This is the first prototype, and it exists in the Science Museum and in London. And I think is that correct? It's in London? Yeah. So it's in the Science Museum. And this is obviously a pared down version. And what's interesting about this clock is again, the materials that are being used, how it's being conceived, to keep accurate time over a period of 10,000 years without human intervention is a really fascinating, I think, scientific problem in physics and materials. And I think it's, again, something of an incredible curiosity that something can kind of, again, drive itself over that period of time. And I kept asking Danny, well, what is it going to be? Is it going to be like a windmill or solar? And he said, no, none of that stuff is more than 50 or 100 years. And we're talking, so basically the premise here is that they're going to have some type of wires that expand and contract at a high rate outside that can capture the energy of expansion contraction through the sun and through the cold of the night and the heat of the day. Also, there's going to be a slot within the mountain that at the zenith would be able to set the time so it can recalibrate itself on a daily basis. So this is something that is meant to keep very accurate time over a long period of time. The mountain itself, Mount Washington, is currently, the mountain of choice. It's up, and one can go to this mountain today, and I think that, if I'm not mistaken, that somewhere along up into this area, a slot will be cut where the zenith of the sun can be picked up, and it can recalibrate itself from that. Some other shots of the mountain. So this mountain is also now in possession, I think, or available to be developed into a chamber, and has the conditions of that rock is solid enough, that it's impermeable, that it can withstand a fair amount of jostling should an earthquake occur and still maintain its structure. All these conditions of the chamber, how the chamber can be built to withstand, because chambers change over time too, and so all this type of thinking is being brought to the creation of the chamber within this mountain. Now the chamber itself, there is no current design, but Danny was nice enough to send me a whole bunch of things that he found interesting as chambers, as underground structures. This is the Russian subway system being constructed. This is the salt chambers outside of Warsaw that were these large carved chambers with sculptures are there for the public viewing. This is in France. It's a cathedral in France. These are the sewers in Japan. I don't know if any of you have seen them. They're pretty wild. And this is more of an organic type of chamber entering down into a cave. I think this is in France as well. So the Gallery 10,000. So the caves of Lascaux, in a way, these are some of the earliest paintings. Some of them date back 20, 30,000 years. Beautifully drawn. And this is one of the few figures that appears, and it's actually a figure of a fallen hunter. But most of them are just animals and spears. But here's one of the few figures, again, probably representing the greatest consequence of the hunter is to lose a battle to the animal and to give up their life in pursuit of the hunt. And again, I find I've not had a chance to ever see them, but they are the impulse of the painters again was not to send messages to us, but to again lay down what their system of thinking, what was important to them during their lives, and again, I wanted to keep to that idea that I don't want necessarily a time capsule with the images, but to try to call out the kinds of things that really truly represent our culture. And then the big question was, well, I'm a photographer, and why not go back to these types of paintings? Why photography? And so for a long time I kept thinking, can I make a case for photography being the medium of choice to have exhibitions of the photographic process? Some of you may be familiar with this Nicephore Niepce's first photograph. So this is the first fixed image ever that still exists today. In 1838 was the date that this was formed, very primitively. It took a whole day to expose it. But from this image, all images have cascaded forward. I mean, before that was a camera obscura, where they could still see the image on the back of the ground glass for almost 200 years. No one knew how to fix it. And finally, there was a way to capture it. Again, primitive, but all of a sudden it says, yes, it can be done. And it's from the capturing of this image that all future images came out of. So if we think of, the still, motion picture, video, multimedia, all of that starts with this very simple, primitive image. And what I started to think about is, well, it's a direct outcome. The photographic image is a direct outcome of the Industrial Revolution. It's really part of the process, part of the handling of chemicals and materials and plastics and dichromates and light-sensitive materials, understanding cameras and optics and lenses, and all of that are all really a direct result. And that photography coming into being, we shape it as human beings. We create the images and find ways to refine them, but at the same time, those images are shaping us in a powerful way. And I think if I look back at the last 150 years of photography, it has told us more about ourselves than any previous histories in painting or anything. That all of a sudden the photograph was a ubiquitous form. It wasn't too expensive to make. It wasn't just the enclave of the bourgeois and the church and the state. Now all of a sudden everyone had a chance to make images or be an image through a portrait. And it changed the way we saw ourselves. It changed the way we began to understand the world around us. And it began to bridge many of the things that we couldn't understand or didn't see because they were outside of our consciousness. So the photographs, so if there was a war, the Boer War, or any, all of a sudden these images, the Vietnam War, all of a sudden these images started to come back to us, and we began to learn from these images what these consequences were, what that other world that's going on out there that we hear about but don't see. And when we see, I think because photography is part of everyone's life now, I think if I was to say to everybody in this room, when you think of yourself and growing up, what kinds of things come to mind? And I bet you many of the images of your past homes and your bedroom when you were 5, and the bike you rode and the clothes you wore when you were young are all probably attached to early images that we have memories of that time, but a picture of you at 5, when you look back at it when you're 50, will tell you more and key you right back into that place like nothing else will. And our histories, our personal histories, are linked to photography, as is our larger collective social histories linked to photography. And that it's through that medium that I believe we interpret our world and again shape our world as photography shapes us. And that was really the reason why I felt that this indexical relationship, that photography is this imprint of the world, and that this print represents that imprint, that again made the justification for wanting to use that as the key medium within the 10,000-year cave. So then I thought, well, carbon transfer print, that brings me to, well, if I was going to do a photographic print, what print would I do? And at first I thought, well, I want to do something that is reasonably, practical, and that I could actually have some confidence that it will be there in a cave. Now, I'm assuming a cave is going to be in dark storage for long periods of time. I'm also making an assumption that cabinets can be built, and when the exhibition is brought down, it can be pushed into cabinets that are fairly well sealed from humidity, as well as the cave and the clock needs to have a fairly stable temperature and humidity as well. So I'm assuming the conditions for the clock are also going to be fairly ideal conditions for a print. And I talked to Danny, and he said that's a fair assumption to make. So then I said, okay, well, based on that assumption, what is the most permanent process I could find? And that's practical. And I thought, well, inkjet. We all know what inkjets are. We all know that there's a lot of development in that field. And I started to think, well, if there were an inkjet printer that had pure, very good CMYK inks, cyan, magenta, yellow, black, and if it could jet these pigments onto a material that doesn't corrode, a paper or a mylar or something that I felt had a 10,000-year stability to it, then bingo, I've got it, and then I just have to find that. But in my search of inkjet printers that could jet the same inks that would be used to paint a car. So I was saying a car, if we think of a car out there in the sun every day, getting blasted by the sun and not changing color very much, whatever is in those pigments should withstand centuries and millennia of time in a fairly quality controlled or humidity controlled cave. The thing I could not find was any process that had evolved the kinds of technology that would spray on the paint onto cars onto a perfect CMYK printing process. And even if it were there were kind of noises that somebody was close to it. I didn't feel at this point in time that, with all the other types of materials that would have to be brought in to bring those pigments to a point that could be jettable, and the breaking down of those pigments, that there was anything that I would have in the next 5 to 10 years that could give me any assurance, like a Henry Wilhelm test, any assurance that this has a go-forward stability. So that was my first pursuit, and it kind of ended in, no, I don't think I've got an answer here. So I continued to pull away at things, and I looked at the dye transfer process, which no longer is possible because Kodak dropped the dye transfer process and they made all the matrices for it, and so that in the late 80s, early 90s was a process that was no longer there. So then I went further and actually went back to a process that was developed in around 1855, and it's called the carbon transfer process. And I'm going to read you a bit about it, the history of it. The carbon transfer process is considered by most persons who know it to be one of the most beautiful of all photographic processes. Carbon prints are capable of a wide range of image characteristics that can be virtually any color or tone, and the final image can be placed on a wide variety of surfaces, including glass, metal, paper, as well as various kinds of synthetic surfaces. When the final support has a smooth surface, when the final support has a smooth relief that gives them a real dimensional quality, especially prominent when the photograph is held sideways to the light. Carbon is without question the most distinctive and stable of all photographic processes, with the capability of presenting images with a wide range of image characteristics of virtually any color or tone on a wide variety of surfaces. Finally, carbon transfer prints, which are made up of inner pigments suspended in a hardened gelatin colloid, are the most stable of all photographic prints. So what you're looking at here is a carbon transfer print. And what I'd like to show you quickly is basically, I have to jump out of my program to show this to you because this is on the web. So this is basically what's happening. You create, at that size of that image, you create a negative digitally. So that used to be done filmically by separating a color slide or whatever through an RGB and making negs. Nowadays, you digitize the transparency or the negative, and then you convert it into 4 black and white, high contrast lithographic negatives through a digital process. And that's what you're seeing in the tray here, or on the light table, is a digitized black and white negative. Once you have the negatives made, you then move to, and I have samples of it there, that's actually the carbon and pigments. So these are, I brought some as well. These are the pigments. So you have your cyan blue. Now these all come from quarries. This is stone ground up into very, very fine powder and then suspended in an emulsion. So that's your cyan, your yellow, and your magenta. So those are, and then you also have a black. But those are the key colors. Black is very ubiquitous. It's not hard to find black carbon. But those colors come from specific mines that have stone of that color that are ground up, and there's nothing else in them, and then they're just suspended. And once the stone is suspended, they're turned into these types of sheets. These are light-sensitive sheets. So that is that's a mixture of sugar that the pigment is suspended in, and dichromats, and also which is the light-sensitive aspect of it, and also there's a gelatin. And then it's mixed to a certain viscosity, and then rolled out onto this paper. Once it's rolled out onto the paper, you expose it. So this is a typical exposing device. So it's a very high intensity light, so you're exposing through the negative to the material, which once any light that comes through hardens that color, and once that color is hardened, it can then be washed out. So you've now got it, and now what you're going to do here is you wash out all of the material that hasn't been exposed to light, and it washes away. And what you're left with is the material. So these are the 4 layers being shown. So this is how it's being built up. Each layer is pulled and transferred, and what's happening is that you're using this here, which is gelatin, and this gelatin has been around, which is basically marrow from the cow, from the bones of the cow. And so the gelatin it's a pure gelatin. It doesn't yellow, it doesn't crackle. It's been around for 1,500 years. And this is what allows the different layers to adhere to each other. And then once you have all these layers adhering to each other, then you can take all of them together and transfer them onto a watercolor paper. The watercolor papers, there's really 2 sources of watercolor papers that are known to be able to withstand the test of time. They're about 300 grams, some of the thickest papers you can find out there, built extremely well. And papers that Van Gogh was using, the Fabriano and Arches are the 2 key. One's Italian, Fabriano, Arches is French. These are the 2 key suppliers of paper. When I looked at possibly doing this, one can transfer this onto porcelain, which seems like a much more stable material. One of the issues is porcelain that I voted porcelain down on, and it would be a beautiful print, but one of the reasons was, one, human intervention. Somebody could drop the porcelain and it would disappear, it would be shattered into many, many pieces. The second concern about porcelain was that if there were a lot of temperature variation over time, that the gelatin silver may be tested. In other words, the emulsion layer may be tested against that layer it's on if the expansion and contraction is much higher than the image is, and you can start breaking the bonds between the image and the material that it's holding it together. Whereas when you get this gelatin against this paper, the bonds go very, very deep into the structure of the paper. Therefore, if you have temperature variations, the chances of a failure of the image where it begins to let go and curl up or break away from the paper is reduced to nil. It's almost impossible then to separate the image from the paper. So as long as nothing happens to the paper, that the containment that the paper sits in after the exhibition is in a watertight, pretty airtight, dark chamber, I can't imagine that if you open that up regularly, and then, but any time, you can open it up all the time under dim light and never see a change. I would think as long as water never got in there and damaged the paper, that these would indeed still be there 10,000 years from now on this paper and on this, with this pigment. There is the chance as well that something in 10 years, 5 to 10 years, may come about, some kind of ink jetting process that, that may all of a sudden have a breakthrough. And that, I think, would be an exciting moment. Right now, just to give you an idea, this is one of the largest sizes they can go without a lot of failure. There's really about 3 places in the world that can do this. One's in Cornwall in the UK, one's in Seattle, and one's in Toronto. I've been dealing with both the Seattle and the Toronto. I also went to see the gentleman doing, Gerard doing them in the UK. But the one that's most promising is Todd, who's doing them in Seattle, and that's the website you're seeing is Art and Soul. That's his site where he does these prints. You can do them that size. The price for one of them at that size is about $2,000. 3040s, if he's up to doing them, and it's very difficult to do them. There wouldn't be full 3040, it'd be 3040 watercolor paper. I think the price would jump to about $4,000 or $5,000 per print. So it's very, very labor intensive. It takes about 5 days from beginning to end of process to get one color image in the carbon. So it's very artisan, very hands-on, very, very few. There's a handful. I think there's maybe less than 10 people probably on the planet today that can make that print. So, so it is, again, something that if the 10,000-year gallery were to become a real thing, there may be a chance to revive a craft, I think, for this, to find a way to capture the materials for a long period of time until some other permanent process comes into play. So that's, and if anybody wants to come up later and just look at the print or feel them in those the different colors, you're welcome to play with that. So what I did to keep it interesting is I said, okay, well, I wouldn't want to curate every show. I think that would be a huge burden, and I don't think that would be very interesting. So I asked a couple of my colleagues nearby who would do it without charging me, and I said, would you just put together an idea? If I said, here's the chamber, you've curated, you're a professional curator, you created shows, you know, spend a week or so, think about it, put something together, you know, call your own work of what you've done in the past. So Vid Ingelvix is a great friend of mine, and he's curated many, he's interested in museology, he's interested in very interesting views of how we look at the world. So his working title was called The Museum of the Mundane, and this is what he writes. It is relatively recently that questions around representation, class, gender, and the nature of the everyday have come together to influence the scope of history, whether written or as the subject of museological display. The turn to the everyday past as an object of study has meant an expansion of interest beyond the activities of royalty, the extraordinary to include the prosaic preoccupations of the shoemaker, baker, or office clerk. The greater the temporal distance between ourselves and the past, the more intense popular and professional interest in the mundane seems to become. As one example, the graffiti, often pornographic, found on the walls of ruined Pompeian walls now attract more attention from both tourists and archaeologists as the elegant mosaic floors of the town's wealthy inhabitants. Accordingly, I would propose to work with the elements of the banal, the mundane, and the everyday of our era. There are two possible approaches I am considering for this initial proposal. The first would produce a kind of photographic museum of the mid-century banal, to highlight ordinary commercially available products popular in the mid-20th century as drawn from photography collections found in two major Canadian archives, those of the Library and Archives Canada, National Design Council Archives, and the Archives of Ontario, Eaton's department store archives. Eaton's is actually one of the largest department stores that went out of business about 10 years ago. They've been in Canada for almost 100 years. The accompanying 20 images are drawn from these two sources. Further research at other sites could, of course, be carried out if deemed necessary. The second approach would involve the reproduction in some visual form of the material goods and ambience found in a typical corner convenience store or dollar store. The two sites each have their attractions. The very notion of convenience is itself part of the ethos of our time, with the range of products functioning by default as a kind of unofficial pole of what we feel are the true necessities of life: cat food, milk, bread, lottery tickets, AA batteries, cigarettes, etc. As for the dollar store, it can be seen as being a repository of simulacra based on the world of commercially derived objects outside its doors. The dollar store shelves are packed with goods that are basically cheap reproductions of existing things, thus engaging with issues of representation, desire, and class in our time. I would propose that for North Americans, it is these kinds of places that unerringly provide the authentic texture of the ordinary life of our time. So what's interesting is when I first saw this proposal, I thought, geez, these aren't the most exciting pictures I've ever seen. But they are interesting in that I kept thinking of them as if we were doing an archaeological dig of some civilization 10,000 years ago, we'd be digging up their spearheads or arrowheads. We'd be digging up, their pots and shards of pots. And these were the things that comprised their daily lives. And in many ways, these are the things that are part of our daily lives, and that archaeologists will be digging up, if they are out there in 10 or 15 or 20,000 years and going to our dump sites, we'll be finding just these kinds of things. And obviously in different states of decay. But I did think it was a different way to begin to, again, lay something down for a museum of the 10,000-year clock, or the gallery, to put something that somehow isn't how should we say, a celebration of what we do, but it's really more of an archaeological dig of who we are and the kinds of things that we surround ourselves with in our day-to-day lives to lead the kind of lives that we lead. Of course, I don't know if any of you had this hockey game, or this is just a Canadian thing or not, I'm not sure. These are all the animals in Canada that you could find, all turned into little plastic animals, so something that everybody should have, I think. So then I went to another friend of mine, and Marcus Schubert, and said, can you go and see what you come up with? Just again, apply yourself to it. And he came up with something where he didn't want to use, again, any of his own imagery, because he's a photographer in his own right, but he wanted to go. So he just literally went onto the web. So none of this has got any copyright approval. This is all just hypothetical here. So he went and collected all this stuff, and he referred to the project as Observations from a Blue Planet. And he took the line, an exhibition in my proposal, an exhibition of images that represent the creative expressions, values, desires, and concerns of our current culture in my proposal, and he kind of riffed off of that. And this is what he says. Presented in the form of diptychs, the photographs in this presentation explore a range of similarities and differences, both within the framework of each pairing and in consort with the other diptychs in the series. All the images are culled from internet sources, then recontextualized by juxtaposition to create discrete meanings to relate to the dynamics of our human condition. These specific selections may be seen as sketches to hint at what could be a more comprehensive investigation. Our world is a cosmic oasis, blessed with an atmosphere profoundly rare in the universe, sustaining a vast system of biodiversity that is nothing short of miraculous. However, we live in a world of extremes of technological development, impoverishment, wealth, extremes of weather, of violence against one another, and of beauty. In a few short centuries, we have ventured forward from the first printed page to telephone networks and now the internet. We evolved from the use of horses as transportations to the pioneering of mechanical flight and scientific deep space exploration to manned landings upon the moon. Since the discovery and development of fossil fuel as a plentiful and versatile source of energy, civilization has experienced staggering population growth and technological advancement, along with an equally staggering polarization of wealth. I see the Earth and its inhabitants as participants in the unfolding of a great dramatic experiment, an experiment of diversification and consumption. In less than a century, for the first time in recorded history, we have become increasingly aware that our actions directly affect the viability of our existence and that of our fellow creatures. Humankind in this century can now effectively be considered powerful as a force of nature in the scale and consequence of the effects of our actions upon the planet. These images are mere shadows on a cave wall that intimate life as we know it. The question remains, what kind of life is it? Ideally, my vision for an exhibition in the 10,000-year clock gallery would be to project 10,000 diptych images in a grid forming a random rolling sequence of images throughout the space. However, if electrical power constraints in such a remote location inhibits the use of computers and projectors, alternatively the production and exhibition of a set of archival prints as per specifications set forth by the organizers would become the final form of this presentation. Upon further talking to him, he thought it would be interesting to use the site of the Long Now to bring in these types of diptychs and to have a constant, while all of this is functional, to have a constant exhibition of these diptychs as part of the project as well. So again, as you can see, he's finding images that many of them are within the have and the have-not category, as I said to him. These things are also paradise or the power or the force of nature. It's tranquil and idyllic paradise, and it's damaging, forceful nature. So these were again some of his ideas that he felt were salient and powerful representations through the photographic medium that talk to the things that affect our time. This is one of the first switchboards, and on the right is an artist's rendering of the World Wide Web. So this brings me around to a project I'm calling In the Wake of Progress, which is, I've edited down, I think I've got a few more than the 20 plus, but I had a hard time editing. But what I wanted to show in this work, in my own work, was to, again, look at the survey of my work, but if I had to pick 30 plus images, what would I pick and why? And as some of you may know, my work has always been interested in trying to reconnect us to what I call the great ages of man, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, and now we're in the Industrial Revolution, technological information age. But those earlier ages are still alive and well and functioning on a scale on our planet that I think many of us, I felt, even I was unaware of until I began this project over 25 years ago. And so I really began to think of, well, what's happened? What's changed? I mean, we've always taken from the Earth, but something's happened in the last couple hundred years, in particular the last century. A lot of what I feel has happened is, number one, the discovery of oil, the internal combustion engine, together, this cheap source of fuel, this incredibly powerful tool, the internal combustion engine, has been able to accelerate our abilities to expand. And I think like any life force, a life force expands into its energy footprint, and when that energy footprint reduces, so does that life force. And I believe we're in this massive century of expansion as a result of that energy, of the discovery of that non-renewable resource called oil. And I think if I go back 100 years where our population was just breaking 1 billion, and in a century we're now at 6.5 billion, that increase is even from in my 50 plus years. I think when I was born, the population was around 2+ billion, and now it's 6.5. So that's almost, 10 billion a decade, maybe 8 billion a decade. And that kind of growth is, I'm asking myself, well, how did that happen? Well, if we look at the transportation, if we look at fuel and ships and trains, cars, farming equipment, all of those things have allowed us the ability to expand at that dramatic rate. So when I went to think about how do I begin to represent this, one of the places I thought was, well, the Railcut series was one of the first significant series I shot in 1983, and it was really the opening up of North America that I was thinking about. That Europe was in the doldrums. It was moving towards North America to replenish its resources, and so I think America was born of a European plunder, so to speak, if we look at the European North America, and that the rail is a thing that opened up the West, and it opened it up rapidly. This was put in place about 170 years ago. These are the rails going through the Rocky, but I wasn't photographing it kind of as a heroic way. I was trying to show it straight on. I wanted to have us contemplate what that line, that gesture through the landscape meant to the landscape and to us. And so it was more of an image that makes us meditate upon that engineered line. And if one looks at the actual, the train, what it's bearing is a load. What's in the load is the same color as the mountain. So it is this kind of, the mountain kind of pouring into the cars, filling them with the material to be brought back to the east, to be brought back to Europe to fuel their continued expansion. So to me, it was an interesting way to begin to look at that landscape and tell a story about what it means to us and the significance it has to humankind and to nature itself. I then I would include several pictures of mines, and one of the things when I photograph mines, to move from the idea of the kind of general, what's the biggest copper mine in the world, what's the biggest iron ore mine in the world, whatever, how do I go from that to the specific, and the bigger is the key word. I went in search of the largest examples of mines in the world. So this is in North America. This is the largest copper mine. It's a Kennecott copper mine just outside of Salt Lake City. And what to me was interesting about this picture and why I'd want to include it is that when one looks at it, one really begins to see almost like an inverted pyramid. It's a big amphitheater. But when you begin to look at the scale of it and you see the trains, that these are actual, this is a train in here, and there's a banana bus somewhere in here. So when you actually see the print, you can see these actual bits of information as what they are in their size. And then the size begins to present itself. And what I was thinking is that, well, these are, in a way, this is the great sublime of our time, that the sublime has been subverted from one that during Turner's period, during the Romantic period, where man was still dwarfed by nature, the Moby Dick story, or the ship being lost at sea in a Turner painting, that this is no longer the fearful sublime. We've now built cars and planes and ships to be able to withstand those types of forces. And so this, to me, is the new sublime, the force of human engineering and capacity to be able to capture these materials and convert them and isolate ourselves from the elements. And in the isolating ourselves from the elements, we have become an element in and of ourselves. So to me, this is one of the ideas that I like to think about when I started to photograph these mines. This in South America is the Chuquicamata mine. I just shot this a year ago. And again, one of the large, this is, I think, the largest mine. The last two argue who's the biggest, but I think there's 25,000 men that work here, and they claim that 30% of all copper in the world comes from this one mine. Where I'm standing, the opposite wall of this particular mine is 5 kilometers away. So just to give you a sense of the scale here. And it's only about a third of the way down. There's still 2/3 to go. This is in Australia. I just got back last year again photographing this mine. This is a place called Mount Whaleback, one of the largest, richest iron ore deposits known in the world. It still isn't a big mine, but the deposit itself is on a world-class level that has been rarely found. The iron ore coming out of it is, actually the darker, just to show you this darker, this is the iron ore here. When you're down in that area, you just pick up a chunk of rock and it just feels like you're picking up a chunk of steel. It's 65% iron ore. And it's supplying pretty much 50%. It's BHP. This is the biggest mine in the world. It's now trying to buy it's trying to buy, I'll think of it in a minute. They're just trying to take over, which would become, by large scale, the largest mine in the world. But they supply about a major amount of iron ore for China, Korea, and Japan. So all of this stuff is being shipped from northern Australia through Port Hedland into those 3 marketplaces directly from here. And I found this place by photographing the largest steel plant in China and said, "Where is all your iron ore coming from?" And they said, "Mount Whaleback in Australia." And then I ended up in Mount Whaleback. So I often trace things back that way as well. I wanted to show that any mine has, as a consequence of mining, is a thing called tailings, if you're familiar with the mining process. This is a tailings pond in northern Ontario. And so what I'm standing on here is about a 70-meter high, 6,000 acre pond. And what they do is they flow out when they take ore out, whether it's copper ore or nickel ore, the actual ore itself is a very small percentage, maybe 5% of the ore. That's the rest of it is just ground up rock, and they have to then, through electrolysis or different processes, extract the minerals out, and then they flow the rest of the rock out. They can't put it back in the hole they've dug because they're continuing to dig. Those consequential holes are still highly mineralized, so that the orange here is actually iron ore that hasn't been used because it's not worth it to take iron ore from this particular tailings, because you have iron ore mines like the one I just showed you. So they just flow this iron back into the tailings pond because it's not worth capturing. But all the silver, the nickel, the copper has been taken out. So this is a consequence of any mining operation is a tailings operation. So you can't have really one without the other. And so a representation of a tailings pond became, I think, an important aspect to show in my exhibit. I also felt that our built worlds, our cities, use dimensional stone versus or stuff that's converted to metals. But we use concrete. But stone is also a very important component of our buildings. So I went in search of some of the largest dimensional stone quarries in the world, and I ended up doing a lot of work in Vermont. So this is granite coming out of a granite quarry, kind of at its last legs. They're still doing some work in the foreground, but most of this has been abandoned. The reason why they've abandoned it is because the fractured stone you see doesn't allow for them to pull blocks big enough to be viable within the marketplace. So once they can't get viable blocks out, then they leave and go to areas that are, again, less fractured, more solid, and begin to quarry that. So this is an example of a quarry in North America. This is in Vermont. Then I also went to Carrara, and these quarries were made famous by Michelangelo, where he went to find his marble. But again, it's some of the finest marble in the world being quarried here. And again, I wanted to show this kind of inverted architecture, the scale of our taking. And I think that both as an image, the images that make us want to look at these places, that draw us to consider these kinds of places. There's also, I feel, a great amount of information about how we're extracting these materials that become present in the work as well. And I think that is one of the beauties of photography, is that it can be a fairly aesthetic work of art or aesthetically seen, but within it is embodied a lot of information that can be drawn out of those photographs by those who spend the time to look at them and to try to understand what is actually going on in these pictures. This is also a recent, it's a different point of view, but these are several recent pictures I took in Australia. And again, that kind of, the extraction of industries is almost like to me like a cavity that is showing the withdrawal of material from the surface of the planet. And then this is, to me, again, around the same lines, this is how we're reshaping to grab this material. It's almost like looking at the inner organisms of ourselves, of intestinal kind of tract that, again, I felt showed that our body and the human body and the landscape share a kind of visual similarity when seen through the photographic medium, and that the surface of the earth is really a skin as well, and how we kind of shape that skin has a profound effect on the planet. And then I began to think, well, at this point in time, where we sit today, the story can't be complete if I didn't bring in the idea of oil. And this is a photograph I took recently in Canada, in northern Alberta, and it's some of you may have heard. It's called the oil sands. And if you look at this is actually one of the most significant deposits of oil in the world. Only northern Alberta has the second largest source of oil, known oil on the planet, after Saudi Arabia, from their drilling tests. Basically, the difference here, though, is that this here is the overburden. So in the back here, we have the boreal forest, which is the second largest forest in unadulterated forests on the planet after the Amazon, and equal as a carbon sink almost to the Amazon. These are two. If the Amazon is considered the right lung of the world, the boreal forest is the left lung. So it is a very important tract of forest. And then so the forest is being cleared for this area. This is the overburden, about 7 meters or 20 feet. And then here is where the oil is coming from. This is the oil sands. And this is about 60 to 70 feet deep. The area that can be mined this way is close to the size of Florida. What's happening is that here's a truck carrying this. 12% of that is bitumen that can be converted into oil, and the rest of it is sand. So what we have happening here is that companies from all around the world are now buying leases in northern Alberta to extract this particular fairly dirty oil. I think Al Gore spoke about the oil sands at the last TED conference. I thought what he said was quite interesting. He said, if we look at our human addiction to oil as a junkie addicted to heroin, going for the oil sands is like shooting up between our toes. I thought I kind of said it clearly. So anyways, what's happening is, and what a lot of people don't understand, in fact, recently what's spurred our government, the Alberta government, just to throw $2 billion at it is California. Thank you, California. California was saying, we're not going to accept this oil. It's got too much of a carbon footprint for our liking to accept it. So they're now trying to find ways to sequester the carbon. But what's happening is that to get this oil out, they have to create vast amounts of steam. And so basically for whatever the CO2 footprint for a barrel of oil, conventionally like Saudi Arabia oil, this is about 4 times more CO2 footprint to get this oil out. So we're burning natural gas to create a dirty oil, which is a fairly clean burning fossil fuel for a very dirty burning fossil fuel. And so there's a lot of discussion about sequestering this, and I think it's high time that this discussion were to happen. And I was very encouraged that California actually stood up and said, we got problems with the CO2 footprint. And the fact of the matter is, if every lease that's out there right now, they've sold off during the last government, provincial government in Alberta, they sold off so many leases, and each lease needs a steam plant. If they built every steam plant that's on the books right now, there's 30 million Canadians. If we all went to zero footprint, in other words, we were all able to go to a zero carbon footprint, and all the 30 projects came on stream, Canada would still be out of compliance for the Kyoto Accord. So that being said, I know we're not going to go to zero footprint. If this goes ahead, I figure Canada will have the dirtiest CO2 footprint on the planet. So I'm kind of a little upset about that myself. So that is one of the key things, that there's tons. Like, it's created the largest surface engineering project on the planet, the largest toxic lakes in Canada, and possibly on the planet as well. And it's the size of the forest being affected is unprecedented, and they've only touched 1%. So there's 99% that they still know of, and they haven't explored the whole region. This is another massive oil field. This is the one where, if you've seen the movie There Will Be Blood, but this is around Bakersfield. This is around the current oil fields. These are the first oil fields that had been discovered, and the beginning of the big oil boom in California. And so again, this oil field is still alive and well, still producing over 1 billion barrels of oil per year. But it's doing it through jack pumps. So the first kind of half of a well's life is under pressure, so they just turn on the tap when they need it, and we don't need it, turn it down a bit. But then the pressure runs out, and there's still half the oil down there. So that's when they begin to pump it. And then now what they're doing is they're doing a similar thing that's happening in Alberta. They're pumping steam down into the area where the oil is, and the steam is creating a more viscous flow of that oil, and that oil is coming up. So in a way, that landscape of oil and what brought this dirty century into being is oil. And I felt again that it was very important to begin to show where these key sources of oil were coming from. This is in Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea. Many of you probably didn't know, because I didn't know until I got there myself, that it's there that the offshore oil platform was invented by a Polish engineer, because the fishermen about 30 kilometers off of the shore of Baku knew this place as oily rocks, and that there was always a skim of oil on the surface of the water, so they knew that there was oil on the land in Baku, so they figured there must be oil seeping out of the rocks out on the Caspian Sea. How do we get it? They brought in a Polish engineer who figured out how to do an offshore platform. It was about 20 meters deep, so these are all 20-meter kind of stilts. They would take this barge out onto sea, drop the stilts, build a platform on top, start to drill. So it was a fairly easy drill, but it was really the beginning of offshore oil. And then Baku, where I went onto shore, all of that oil field had been exhausted and exploited, and it was a dead zone, a totally dead zone. The water, the reflection you're looking at here is a pool of oil. So when the Russians left this area 20 years ago, because it was largely, this oil field propelled Russia through the Second World War and even through the First World War, it was a key resource and it was light sweet crude as well, which is the desired oil. So this was, these were the fields that fueled the Russian Empire during its last 80 years, and it had been left for dead. So this was a dead oil field. So this is, to me, some images of the end of oil. So these are all, this is the great oil fields, again, of Baku. Interestingly enough, when I got here, they were at $70 a barrel, which is when I was here, it was $70 a barrel. There was still enough to pump, so they started reigniting a lot of these wells, because even at low levels, they were at that price point, they could make them profitable. And I can imagine that this thing has been totally resurrected by now because of the price of oil at over 100. Refineries, that going further down the process now, the material's been gathered, the oil has been gathered. And if we look at any material in the world in terms of weight, if you look at sand used for buildings, or if you look at stone, or if you look at copper ore, iron ore, any of those, the heaviest amount, the most amount of material, the heaviest amount of material that we move on the planet is oil. So refineries all around the world, taking that material, converting it into fuels, plastics, fertilizers, all of those things. Again, these are what those places that we made look like. This is in Texas City, the largest refinery row in the world, I think, in terms of outside of Houston. Shot from a helicopter. All the tanks where the oil is being held. This is at a refinery where different oils come in. So if you read the labels, you can see that different types of crude are coming in. You got West Texas crude that can come in. You can get stuff from East Coast Canada. You can get stuff, whatever you need. If you need more asphalt, you can go for sour crude. If you need more high lubricants or high octane fuels, you can get your oil from. And so it's spot price, and the oil refinery opens and closes the taps based on the orders from the customers. Then I began to also think, well, what is the direct outcome of all of this fuel? That it changed our cities, it changed our infrastructure. This is in Los Angeles, the 110 and the I-5. I think this is the intersection, one of the busiest in the world. And where the freeway was pretty much invented, as well as probably the suburb. So again, the development of all this technology, the fuel created a world in which we transport ourselves at fairly high speeds, and mobility has been the key driving force of the middle class. So we've actually been able to create an affluent middle class, I think, directly as a result of the automobile being able to move us around, and the economies that came out of that, of the building of that infrastructure and the making of the car and the production and the money that came from oil proceeds have allowed us to have a large affluent middle class. What fuels the highways is cars. This is a logistics yard for VW, again showing what what is feeding this great infrastructure. And so this is outside of Houston. This is where these are all Volkswagens. They all appear white because when they come off the ships, they're coated in white plastic so that the paint doesn't get scratched. And once they deliver them to the dealerships, they pull the white plastic off, and you have a unscratched car. And then again, the consequence of all these cars are vast collections of the waste of the car. This is this is just outside of San Francisco, shot in '99, I think, around Modesto. It's Wesley. I don't know who knows. Wesley's got a small gas station, but it's just in behind. Tire pile was discovered by me through reading a book by John McPhee called Duty of Care. It was an essay, and his description in the first paragraph was so compelling, I said, I have to go photograph that place, and this is one of the images I made from that place. And 3 months after I photographed it, it was hit by lightning and caught fire, so you may have heard of the flames were about, they figured there were, at its peak there were 40 million tires, and then the California Environmental Protection Agency didn't like that many tires in one place, and they said, we've got to figure out something. So they did a pilot project where they were burning the tires and creating enough electricity for 14,000 homes. And they had reduced the pile. When I got there, the pile had been reduced from what they figured as 40 million down to about 20 million. And so I was shooting it at its 20 million scale. And then 3 months after I photographed, it got hit by lightning and it all caught fire and the project was over. The other types of expressions that I feel are a direct result of not only the protection of our interests, once we built a big middle class, we needed a way to protect it, and particularly United States of America. This is in just outside of Tucson, Arizona, an area called Amark, where they have over 4,000 military jets that are either mothballed in preparation for active duty. So they have everything from the ready in 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 10 week, 3 month, half a year, and some just for parts, and some that are just decommissioned. These are totally decommissioned transport planes for the military that would all be will all be going into recycling. But again, it's that incredible infrastructure and the tools that we've invented to not only protect our interests and to protect ourselves from aggression, that technology and the Industrial Revolution has brought this type of expression forward. These are fighter jets. Again, these are all decommissioned in the same yards. I went to photograph the suburb. I thought the fastest growing suburb in North America right now is Las Vegas. So I did a flyover of Las Vegas last year to take a look at how the suburb is expanding. And I understand it's expanding largely because Nevada has a very small property tax and it's still very cheap and personal tax, and it's still very cheap to buy a home. So a lot of people might sell a home either here or in LA and buy something for half the price and bank the rest and live very inexpensively. Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam. Again, what was interesting to me about this picture was the white rim on the edge of the lake, and that it's beginning to tell a story. I think Lake Mead is going down at about 6 inches a week. It's at its lowest point ever. And if it continues at its current rate, the dam is going to stop being efficient very soon. And if anything should happen to that lake, the whole idea of Las Vegas is just a dream. This is shipbreaking in Bangladesh. I do a jump. This is again directly a relationship to the Industrial Revolution. To me, this is where first world ships go to die in a third world country under very primitive conditions. So it is almost like stepping back and looking at the world through Dickens' eyes in our current contemporary world. And the scenes that it created were so surreal that they seem as if they are from another world. And I felt that was somehow, and it showed the figures in the center, who were the players within this theater of the insane, where they're taking down oil tankers and ships, with nothing more than a cutting torch and bare feet, and not even cutting goggles. They're just cutting these ships down, and no cranes in sight. And they're using as a way to bring all the parts up. These are all little winch huts up there, all built from salvaged parts of a ship. And that's really the only highest piece of technology that they have. But everything, the whole process, is driven by parts they can find from ships. Yeah. So then one of the largest engineering projects on the planet, the Three Gorges Dam, I did a project on that, and I thought that would be important to include this image as well. It's not only the representative of China kind of coming of age after what we would call a 200-year kind of hiatus of being fairly powerful and significant, and then receding for a couple hundred years and now coming back. China even refers to this dam as the Second Great Wall of China. And so to again represent it in the gallery, I thought would be an interesting thing to show the scale in which, again, man was operating, but this dam bigger than 50%, and probably I would guess, I suspect this will be the biggest dam ever built. I don't think something this big will ever be attempted again. Even when this one was built, they said that they were able to detect a wobble on the planet when they filled the reservoir, and each one of these turbines is 700 megawatts, and a nuclear reactor is about 1,000 megawatts. So each one of these is almost a nuclear reactor in terms of power output, and they have 32 of these turbines. So it is a massive, massive project. And if you ever get to see the print itself, you can see small figures all throughout this working way, like ants in a massive ant farm. Again, where all of our products coming from, this is a big running shoe factory. The total workforce for the Yuyang shoe factory was 250,000. This particular compound had 45,000 workers, and this is 20,000 of them going to dinner. So that's quite something. Again, China, coal, a key material and a key energy source for China. And again, one of the things I think, if we look at all the things that are happening out there, to me, coal is the scariest of them all in terms of, there's they say about 1,000 megawatt dirty coal burning power station being built per week in China. And they're still being built all over the place in North America. And each one of those dirty coal burning 1,000 megawatt plants is going to be there for 40 years, spewing the worst that we can imagine out into the air. So I think coal is the real dirty secret out there in terms of how if we're going to stem global warming and the CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere, we're going to have to stare this one in the eye. Again, in China, I've always kind of liked this picture in that this woman is almost 100 years old. She's been through 4 great changes in China, from the dynasty to the republic, from the republic to the communist, and from the communist to the what I call the authoritarian capitalist system of today. And here she is on her stoop with e-waste as industry on her front porch. And this is, again, e-waste where they're taking all the chips and removing the chips and recycling all the precious metals off the chips. And then they're grinding these circuit boards and taking all the last metals off of that. And that's the end process, end line of computers and computer boards in China. So 50% of all our computers that are recycled in China. This gives you a bit of a snapshot. Not that I think video is going to be in the 10,000 year gallery, but it's an interesting. Get some sound on that. Yeah, so she does 400 of those a day, and that's why we can't compete with that anymore, because they're not using robotics, they're using this massive workforce, and they're highly motivated because they think in China there's a mobile community of about 100 million that are looking to find work from the rural into the urban centers. So the pressure on these workers to output every day is severe because there's so many workers looking to take their job. This is the biggest mobile phone company producing phones in China, Bird Mobile. This is the lunchroom of the largest garment factory, Youngor, in China. The biggest chicken packing plant I could find in China, which produced, they dressed out and processed 100 million chickens a year. Which sounds like a lot, but I actually asked the question, well, how many live fowl would there be in China at every given day of the year? And on a daily basis, they estimate between 5.5 and 6 billion fowl are alive and in husbandry mode in China. So the processing of 100 million is actually a fairly small. And I thought 100 million, if a chicken feeds a family of 4, then the yearly output of this whole plant would be enough to feed a third of China for one meal, which just gives you a bit of perspective. And this is, again, a large factory, 22,000 people producing coffee makers and irons for ironing. They did 22 million irons and 3 million coffee makers a year. This is the inside of the coffee making plant. If any of you have seen the movie Manufactured Landscapes, there's an 8-minute opening shot, and it's basically a dolly shot from there all the way along there, pointing into the aisles of this particular plant where they're making coffee makers. So it's an opening shot that's gotten a lot of acclaim in terms of how to take a still image and unpack it and show through film what a still is trying to show in a singular combined image. But again, the size of a factory floor in the new, and that's what I found interesting about China and why I wanted to bring it into the idea as well of the gallery, is that a lot of this is the invention from here, from the West. And what's happened is that it's been unbolted from the factory floor here, taken to China, amplified to a factor of 10 because they're supplying back to the world. And the population's been growing ever since, and that these manifestations are now apparent there, but their source is actually of the assembly line, the production lines, the extrusion machines, all of that, the plastics, the materials are all, I think, mostly Western invention. And then the cities of Asia that have grown up, Shanghai, Hong Kong. That's sound effects. And again, the density of living, and then as a kind of concluding image, this kind of forest of what I call the international style gone crazy. I don't think the Bauhaus guys ever intended it to look like this. Actually, when they developed the high-rise for high-density living, there was supposed to be a park of almost equal floor space for natural walks and to be able to enjoy the outdoors with high-density living. They obviously cut out the second part of the equation on most of this. So that's the presentation, and so now I think we're going to do some Q&A.
Formidable. It's going to be interesting to see what these images look like in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time, and 10,000 years' time. Because what took you to these places was sort of evident in kind of the essay that you tell around each one of them. This is the largest something or other. This is the most damaging something or other. It's the most extractive something or other. And the images by themselves, they're so big, they're so rich, they're so detailed, they're so real, that a person walks up to them and the first thing they're doing is, they're going in close. Oh, look at that little tiny person, what's going on? And they tell themselves a story of what's going on there without necessarily your valence on it, that this is a bad story. And the Three Gorges Dam is incredible. It's terrible. A couple million people moved. There's, what do you say, 32 dams under construction now in China, all this kind of thing, each time a horrible problem. But on the other hand, whoa! And I have a feeling people will look at these things in future time, and it's like us looking at sailing ships. The tall ships we got coming in shortly. And, it was rum, buggery, and the lash for the guys who were on the vessels.
Right.
It was a floating prison on which you might get drowned. But we look at those things, wow, how did they do that? It's incredible. So I have a feeling this kind of imagery, you're dead right, is exactly the sort of thing to launch through time. And my guess is that the same thing happened with the cave paintings, that they had one set of things in mind. But then an important thing to remember about the cave paintings, and it's what your 10,000-year gallery will get at, is there was a first set of cave paintings, but people kept going back into those caves, and they'd see the former images and go, yeah, well, and then sort of write right over it or do a reply or something like that. So their art was about art. They already knew that this was communication through time. So the characters who are curating and contributing to the 10,000-year gallery are going to have this sense of, there's that early stuff and what was in their mind, but I've got my own interpretation of it. And they're going to be responding over centuries and millennia to the sequence of images and the sequence of interpretations. Does that sound right to you?
Well, I would think that it's as you accumulate, as these images accumulate, that there is kind of pressure, because obviously, of the very early ones, of the very, the first ones in, it's fairly open. It's an open text. You can kind of just lay down what you think, but once you lay marks down, then people respond not only to the task at hand, but the marks that have been laid, and so then their marks have the added pressure of trying to either aspire to beat the marks that have been laid, to match them, or and what they're trying to not do is have something that would be considered inferior to what's already been put in play. And there are only, I guess, so many human stories too, so some of the big, great stories get, told very quickly. And that's why I thought that showing the gallery of the mundane is interesting too, because there are like shards. These are like what archaeologists tend to, their stock and trade of what they find when they do digs are little bits and pieces that are of daily life, not these great gestures of human ambition. And so I think there is, all these things are part of the process of bringing in other thinkers and curators to consider what's there and consider what can be or what hasn't been told yet.
Here's a question from Michael M. Wave your hand. What is the history of the carbon image process you propose to use? How did it evolve? What need did it fill? You mentioned there's just 3 places doing it. Is that growing or dwindling? And if all of this happens, will it help it grow?
Well, I mean, I would say rather than get into the whole history, I mean, it was first discovered in the mid-1800s, and there were some French, which the names avoid me, I can't quite get, but if you go to the actual Art and Soul website, the one that, just go Art and Soul carbon transfer printing, it's got a beautiful synopsis of the history there. That's where I was showing you the images as well. So that would certainly help fill in any kind of gaps as to the history. It is very, but it's an early process, and it is a dwindling. There's very, very few who are willing to commit the kind of time and energy to produce these things today. So it is a dying artisan craft, and it would be wonderful, I think, to keep it alive at least until technology can merge and find a replacement for it. Because ultimately, I think these materials will get harder and harder. Like even the gelatin, this gelatin here, the purity of this gelatin, and it's this particular gelatin, it's not any other gelatin. There's one factory that's making this gelatin, and they make it special order for the 3 guys have pooled together, and they get cases of it made because nobody else needs this purity. And if you don't have this purity, you can get yellowing, you can get problems and imperfections in the coatings, therefore causing dimples in the actual print. So these are there's this handful of guys right now that are keeping it alive, and will do so, I guess, as long as. But they're all. Like I've looked at every one of them, they're all over 50. So, and I don't see any young apprentices around either. So there is this kind of moment that we're at where this could very well, as a process, disappear if certain people don't try to or find a reason to keep it alive.
Well, this particular print here, if you put that out in the sun, not in humidity controlled, temperature controlled storage, all this. Just put it out in the sun, like a car. How long would it last?
I think it would do as well as a car. Which would be like probably 30, 40 years before you start seeing fading.
Wow.
Or significant fading.
You said some guy did an accelerated light test.
Henry Wilhelm did a test where. If you look, they did a test for the average viewing wall of a print, starting in the northern hemisphere and all the way down to the equator, and they averaged what a living room wall would get as a lux value, and it was somewhere average around 125 lux value. Henry Wilhelm does his tests at 450 lux, which is about 4 times that intensity. 12 hours a day. So he does it for 12 hours a day, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 365 days a year. He did that level testing for 500 years on this print and figured the shift was less than 1%.
All right.
So it's about as solid as you're going to get.
I think this is something that spread the word. Collectors, museums, should want this quality of archival material. And if they request it and pay for it, it's not that much more expensive than regular good prints. It sounds like we could keep this process going and getting better over time. I think a lot of people were fascinated by the mundane gallery.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually smart to draw something from the 1950s or 60s that we already feel sort of archival about. But one of the questioners says, wouldn't it be interesting to really collect stuff randomly, which is actually the sort of stuff that you do find in archaeological digs and so on. So send out a random trawl on the net for images and bring those things back and then give them this treatment. And so, of all the stuff that's on in a particular minute on Flickr, 1/umpteenth of that becomes the record of this time. And maybe you do another one in 10 years and compare and contrast. It wouldn't be Flickr then, it'll be something else. But is that a way to approach mundane?
Oh, I think so. I think because ultimately what we actually find interesting, and I think we're caught in a current of intense information, things flying by us at incredible speeds, trying to keep up to it in our individual lives. So it's very hard to kind of pull out of that current and to think, well, what would be interesting, as a shard to leave behind? Mm-hmm. What speaks about our value system? Because I think that value system is probably one of the most interesting things to leave a record of. What was it that we aspired to? What was it that we desired? What was it that what do we sneer
at, like graffiti?
Yeah.
People look at old magazines, they're not so interested in the articles or the illustrations. What they really study is the ads, which is, at the time, we're going right by those if we can. And
right.
Yet, they're what's paying for the system, and they're also what's most fascinating later. Why is that?
I think because we're always interested in the fact that as human beings, there's something enduring about us, that we're always interested in, in the similar things. Like there was, I remember going into the Orkneys once, and we went to an old, it was a mound, and it was a Viking graveyard. And there was graffiti in it, and somebody deciphered it all. And it was mostly gossip, who was the girl to chase at the time, and all this and so they interpreted it all, and then everybody's like fascinated with the fact that their mind, the guy's minds were in the exact same spot, 3,000 years ago, and so I think that whenever we can see something that crosses millennia, that says we haven't really changed that much as a kind of a human animal, that we're still interested in similar things, that we still have that kind of day-to-day life that we have to service, and we do it differently, but it's still servicing our day-to-day lives.
All of the cave paintings and the glyphs and the stuff they're drawing in all the caves, there's always lots and lots of vaginas. And big
What's
ladies.
important to them?
Yeah, it's clearly so clearly pornography will be part of the record.
Well, I showed some pornography from Pompeii, and that's considered one of the great highlights of Pompeii, to go see where the brothels were.
There you are. Nothing changes. Gwen Roberts has a question. How has your TED wish unfolded?
Which one?
I don't know.
I was in the 3 wish
category.
That
was right. Okay, so...
I was the one that convinced him to go to 1, because 3 was like inheriting 3 big jobs.
Tell the story.
Well, they're all in different states.
This was 2004, right?
Oh, it's a 2005 TED, but I heard about it in 2004.
And there was a bunch of money involved.
$100,000, 3 wishes.
The idea of the TED prizes, then it was 3 wishes, a bunch of money, and a pretty rich and capable audience at the TED conference in Monterey. And the idea was to harness all of that talent and interest to help out the winner make his wish happens. Yeah,
and I think what's interesting is I kind of surprised Chris Anderson, who's he was the show curator and owns the show as well, the TED conference, and I think what he expected, and he even told me he expected that as an artist, I would somehow be able to be interested in taking my work and using that audience to help disseminate that work into the world. And he was surprised when I told him that that's not what I wanted to do. That ultimately, as a fine artist, I had felt that my work was already gaining traction out there. And when somebody says to you, go out there and make three big wishes that can change the world, think big, and then direct all of that, or direct them at me and my work to make my work popular, I thought there's something, a little self-serving in that whole approach. So I converted my thinking into trying to say, well, if we're going to change the world, number one, I thought, well, if it's that easy to change the world, why haven't we done it? If $100,000 and 3 wishes can do it, but it still, it was a chance to kind of begin to grapple with, what was a possibility. So the three things that I ended up thinking about, one was how do we begin to disseminate information, and trying to find something that was happening at the time that made sense. And so one of the wishes was to take a site called World Changing. Some of you may have heard of it, worldchanging.com. They produced a book called World Changing: The User's Guide to the 21st Century, which was an Abrams book.
Got them out in the lobby.
Yeah, so that was, again, part of the outcome of that, to get that going. And I think for a while it worked pretty well, and it had a bit of a flare out, and it's now starting to kind of come back again, slowly, and maybe in a more sane and careful approach. But I think on the outset, it did do many things to start bringing the conversation. What I liked about that is it was an open concept where people could post what was working out there. It wasn't a bitch session, but it was, what can we do to create a more sustainable world? Here are the good ideas and models for that, for a sustainable world. So that was one. The other thing I thought is bringing, and everything had to do with raising consciousness. The other one was how do we get the kids to start thinking sustainably? And I started with the idea of a thing called In My World, having kids teach them about sustainable thinking in a fun and easygoing way. We finally got WGBH in Boston to jump on it, and we got some funders from the buyers jumped into it, and created a site called Meet the Greens, and it's like a family greens, and the kids are actually far more environmentally astute and how to function in saving water, recycling, and all that than the parents are. And so it's this constant pushback from the kids to the parents about building a more sustainable world in a fun way. So that's currently evolving and developing as a site and growing as a site. And WGBH, if you don't know it, is one of the larger producers of public broadcasting in the United States. And it's now coming up through a feed through TV Ontario, as well as it's coming up into Canada as well. And of course the web is international. And the third one was to do an IMAX film, but it never ended up being an IMAX film. Manufactured Landscapes ended up getting a bit of the updraft of wanting to do a film based on my work. So I did get a lot of support around it when it came to producing the film. And I still think that one day I'd like to still produce a film based on the themes that I've done, except doing it in a large format version. I suspect by the time I do get to that stage, there may be a digital solution to shooting on that high resolution and projecting it large and showing our world filmically in what I'm doing as a set of stills. So that's still in progress.
Going. Well, I have just two more questions. I should mention there are signed copies of Ed's Corey's book in the lobby, which I recommend to you. And if you go over to the reception, the book that Long Now sells called The World Without Us. The World Without Us is in written journalistic form the sort of thing about infrastructure that Ed Burtynsky has been doing with photographs. It's basically thinking through, if people suddenly weren't here one day, what would be the changes over time to everything, to buildings, to infrastructure, to all these things. And it's a wonderfully detailed and well-researched travelogue, basically, to all the places in the world that show how things would proceed. So it's got the infrastructural level that you do. Two questions. One is, you're now using more video. YouTube is huge and getting huger. You know, there's Flickr and there's YouTube. Well, you've taken care of archival Flickr. Your next task is to figure out archival video. You know, how can you do some kind of moving images with sound that is basically platform-free enough or platform set in stone enough so that that can be seen over time?
Well, I think the problem even gets bigger than that, in that the assumption that, you know, even 1,000 years from now, that the sources of energy are going to be anything close to what we have now in terms of being able to feed this equipment to be able to replay the things. The thing is that it's so, I mean, the replay of a print like that is you open your eyes and you put some light on it. That's a pretty straightforward replay. And the minute you get any media, any player, and the source of power to mesh up with all of that. So, I mean, I can't imagine 1,000, even 500 years from now, that the source of power will look anything like this, you know, 120 volts, 60 cycles. You know, that it might be a whole other DC type thing that even if you kept the player dry and there, you know, waiting for power to play back the thing that you want, or even a computer that can play it back, the fact that the stuff that will be around that can actually, you know, respond to it may be a bigger question. So the whole idea of the more technologically sophisticated it is, I think the more difficult it is to have a deep future. You know, that there's a danger of either file formats or technology or power sources not meshing, and that you have the intelligence or the skill or the will to go back and reverse engineer it and to find out what it needed from back then to bring it up on screen, which may be obviously very simple enough to do if the equipment's there, if all the circuitry and all the boards and all the stuff hasn't deteriorated to the point where it won't play in several thousand years.
Which you stated the problem very well. And the solution obviously remains to be found, if any. One question I got from a couple people, just a quick one. Can this carbon print transfer process be used on, say, the walls of the chamber? If there are some images that, you know, people just absolutely want to have there, and it's very fine-grained limestone. It's almost marble, so we can polish it as fine as you want. Could this stuff go on the surface? Could go on.
Yep, you can just, you use a gelatin. You put a gelatin coating on it. The gelatin, it works with porcelain and limestone, anything like that. It'll get long fingers into that, and then you wet the surface, you roll the print on, you let it dry, and then the release paper has less of a tension, less of a stickiness than the thing that you're putting it against. Then you pull the plastic back, you pull the release paper off, and you now have a permanent print on a wall.
Ooh, let's do that. You're a working artist in full stride. What's coming next?
Another big exhibition in Washington at the Corcoran, where I'm going to be launching a lot of this stuff I showed you about kind of the landscape of oil. I also subtitle it The Oil Party. You know, like the whole notion that we're at this kind of moment.
You're showing it in Washington, so you figure party you'll get in
the
there.
party's over there. So it is very much looking at that landscape, trying to find ways in which it's presented itself to me over time that I think is relevant to put together into a book of images that kind of and some essays that begin to encapsulate how our lives and our urban landscape and our kind of middle class has been shaped by not only the Industrial Revolution but this incredible source of energy that is here for both good and bad, that has allowed us to achieve what we have. So to me, you know, and I had kind of this idea of oil in 1997, but I think by 2009 when I'm showing, it'll be 12 years where I worked on the project. So I'm trying to bring it to kind of a closure, to try and somehow put it into a book. And as my Quarry book has brought things together, the China book, to do one on oil now.
In the oil business, they would describe what you've just gone over as downstream. And once the oil is found, the things you do to get it out in the world. What's upstream for you? What do you want to shoot?
What have I been shooting? I just photograph something very different than I normally do. I just went to CERN and photographed the particle accelerator,
Great.
which was really exciting to see. And the kind of
That's kind of an up project.
that is a more up project. It's kind of, why does anything exist question. But I've been again looking more into the new processes that are out there. Video. I'm starting to look at capturing sound and video and using my themes a little bit more, and trying to see how that might work into my work. And I'm pretty excited about some of the technology that's coming on stream in terms of the digital technology, the new, like the Sony H3, you could put on really good lenses and you're at a level of almost film quality at just above $10,000, video camera. So the ability, I think, to work at the kind of quality level that I'd like to work at, and that's what's often held me back is, as soon as you jump into 35 millimeter film, as you know, you're into huge budgets, a lot of limitations, rentals, and so you have to be spending most of your time raising the funds to do these things. Whereas the new technology is going to allow artists like myself, with means, but not those kind of means, to be able to continue to produce work in my own way, at my own pace. Without a lot of pressure around me to be able to produce, projects that I think can be very exciting, and again, bridging those kinds of worlds that I tend to do photographically, but expanding the medium through which I do it, through to sound and motion.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right.